Welcome to our second webinar on Australia. This webinar is titled Regulatory and Market Considerations of Earth Observation and focused on Australia, provided by the SME Southern launch from Australia. We're very happy to have Southern Launch as our presenters, and we're very happy as well that you are joining us. Our speakers are going to be Peter Williams and Scott Schneider. So I encourage you all to please leave your comments or your questions under the chat box. You can at any time use the chat. We will be monitoring it to make this interaction more alive. If you have any questions about the Australian market, regarding precisely some aspects of regulations or the aspects of the market, as I said, please don't hesitate. And without, well, as you know me, my name is Sandra Cabrera, and the project lead of Connectio. So I will leave you to Scott and Peter to tell us more about the market in Australia. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Sandra. Thanks, Veronica. Hi, everybody joining. It's a pleasure to be participating in this. And following, I understand you had a workshop some days ago as well. So the intention is for this to complement and to try and give some further context if you are interested in doing business in Australia with the capabilities of your organizations. Peter and I work for a company based in Australia, which provides launch services, and we'll go through what those services are and how they may be applicable to the kind of work that you do. But the other aspect of this talk will be to try and give an overview of just how, what type of applications or the general really the general context for Earth observations uses in Australia, the government sector and the private sector, and then also focusing a bit on some practical considerations of actually doing business in Australia for any type of international organization or international entity, let's say. Things like the contract law, the corporations law, privacy concerns and things like that. So this is an open, well, I put together the talk to be an open forum. So if you have any questions, happy for you to either turn on your mic or put a question in the comments box. If I don't see it in the comments box, Veronica or Sandra can pause me and we can address it. And hopefully there's going to be 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the presentation to address something that maybe wasn't covered or something like that. A caveat, I suppose, something to just be aware of as we're going through this is that my specialization isn't in Earth observation or remote sensing. I have, of course, an understanding in it because of generally working in the space sector. But the information that we're putting here is actually, I think, it's beneficial because it's really just indicating where you can find out more information and where you can go to try and engage with Australian organisations, either as collaborators, suppliers, or customers. So that's hopefully giving a bit of an overview. And I'm hoping my slides are changing as I'm going through them. So yeah, that's essentially what I was addressing earlier. So the main issue, I think, for Australia is that right now, and there is incentive to try and change this reliance, but right now there's a high dependence on international data. For the sources of the data are all international for what Australia uses its Earth observation applications for. So it's coming from foreign owned and operated satellites. That's something that industry and the government in Australia is looking to change. And if you are interested in doing business in Australia, so this might be something to think about if you were to set up a subsidiary or another organization in Australia. That might be that might appeal to the market here. The other aspect to consider is that Australia, as I understand it, has quite a specific use for Earth observation products, not only because of the nature of natural disasters here, but just generally the priorities of our maritime environment, both biologically and in terms of national security and things like this. And also our agricultural environment is quite unique as well in terms of how broad it is, depending on which area of the country is being looked at. However, the main capabilities of Australia really come down into three categories. The first one is its ability to perform high quality integration of data, particularly with on-ground data. And it does this through a variety of ways. There's companies that perform this. So AAM is actually a leading organization that's based in Australia that provides geospatial services and operates in several countries. For things like mapping and asset management. Digital Earth Australia is actually run by the government. It's a government program that provides open data, and that does partner with international entities. The IMOS is a collaborative effort of government and private sectors. Excuse me. It's led by a university, and that also provides open data, of course, specifically in terms of maritime management, both from an environmental point of view and also from an asset and equipment point of view, looking at what's in the water in terms of boating and personnel. Data analytics is also a strong point of Australia. The Open Data Cube in particular is an open source analysis tool. So that's the software that's been developed. It's being led by a government research center. And its intention is to try, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with these or not. So if you are, then just ask me to move on or pull me up on it. But the Open Data Cube, I understand it has international users as well. And that's a Python-based software tool that tries to allow a wider use of Earth observation data. So allowing it to be more accessible, I suspect, and making it have a wider application so more people can use it with simplified software tools. Another strong point, which generally not just in relation to Earth observation, but in space activities, is the ground stations. So we have a lot of international collaborations because of unique advantages with low noise, low interference for receiving and communicating with spacecraft. So ground stations is a strong point of Australia. In terms of the actual applications of remote sensing data, as I was mentioning, Australia makes a large point, although it's dependent on international data sources, the use of its Earth observation data is quite unique and broad in terms of its maritime and terrestrial and the meteorological uses as well. And the next slides will speak a bit more to that. There's approximately 140 programs across both the government and non-government sectors that rely, or that really that have a central dependence on Earth observation data. And there are some reports that I have referenced at the end of this talk. When you release this presentation, you can refer to that speak about what those programs are and what they're trying to achieve. They may also give you an indication about where some gaps are in the market and whether your organizations can address those demands. In terms of the benefit that Earth observation data provides to Australia, it's approximately 1.6 billion euro of indirect benefit as well. So of course, the applications of EO data feed into benefiting a wider array of industries. So when you accommodate all that in terms of logistics, it's agriculture, mining is a big one as well. So natural resource management, it has quite a large benefit to Australia, which is good news for your organisations if you're wanting to do business or collaborate with Australian entities. I don't see any questions, so I'm going to keep going. The government is, and I don't know if this is similar with European countries, but the government is the largest consumer of EO data, making up more than 2/3 of the market in terms of consumption. And these are the main, actually, just these three organisations make up 1/3 of data consumption. The first one is the Bureau of Meteorology, which is the atmospheric and environmental and climate agency of the government. And I've listed here the sources of EO data that it uses. One that's maybe more of interest to your organisations is the Csiro, which is the National Research Organisation, both from an industrial applications as well as general scientific interest. So, if I'm not mistaken, it's the Central Science and Industry Research Organisation. So it doesn't only look at science for the sake of science, it also tries to develop and look into programs that actually have industry application. And so two of its, and it does have a space branch as well, and part of that space branch concerns Earth observation. And the Data 61, which I've listed here as an example, is it's more a computing program using artificial intelligence and analytical tools to try and have more efficient and powerful processing capability. And but the reason it's relevant to Earth observation is because they have applied this to a remote sensing project, which looks at, I think it's using Centennial-2 data to manage or monitor coastal activity somewhere in Africa. So that may be of interest to look at. And NOVAR-SAR-1 is a satellite mission under CSIRO being developed by them, which SAR synthetic aperture radar, which uses the S-band for communications. And this is a novel satellite project that uses international partnerships as well. So if you're not familiar with that, maybe have a look at that. I'm not sure how far it is in development, but that may be of relevance. The third one is actually, I think, the largest consumer of data. It's the Geoscience Australia, which is the leading organisation generally, but managed by the government in terms of geographical and geological information. And that aims to provide data in order to, for government decision making and for non-government users to be able to make informed decisions with respect to things like mining and agriculture and general areas that rely upon geographical management and monitoring. So I'm not sure whether this is good information or not in terms of how easy it would be for you to provide services to these organizations, or whether the organizations that you're involved with in Europe already provide services or collaborate with these organizations, and that might be a way to integrate into the Australian market through using existing partnerships that you have with other European entities. Again, I've tried to develop this part of the this presentation to try and inform you with what areas may be in demand in the Australian market. So it's able to inform you whether you can know whether your capabilities in your organizations can actually meet that demand. So this slide tries to speak to where we've found across government and the non-government sectors what the ambitions are of the EO market. So this first one here is a report that was produced a few years ago now through a collaboration primarily with non-government organisations and industry associations, actually, trying to look at how the Australian market, the Australian capabilities can better deliver on what Australia's demands are for Earth observation data. So you can read that report, or at least the executive summary of that report, to get an idea. But I think actually, if you look down the bottom here, you'll see the Space and Spatial Industry Growth Roadmap. That's a more recent report, which isn't really just focusing on Earth observation. It's on geospatial information as well. But that might give you a more relevant indication of where the market is at in terms of how remote sensing fits into this geospatial ambitions of Australia, rather than only the community plan of the Earth observation group. That was published, this Space and Spatial Roadmap was published only a few months ago. So I think that could be of use. The AusCalVal was actually looking at how it was commissioned by the Australian government, but trying to look at how Australia can become a global leader in terms of Earth observation data and applications. Right now, in terms of data processing, Australia considers itself a global leader, but this was looking at where in other areas of Earth observation, the supply chain of Earth observation, Australia can capitalize on as well. So there's a report that speaks to this as well. And this was done in consultation with government, but was led by research and industry groups. And then from the government side, purely, is the Space Agency, which comes under the Department of Industry, produced a roadmap just a couple of months ago, which was quite specific to Earth observation from space and where Australia fits into that and how it wants to try and leverage its capabilities. Again, it doesn't really focus on how it can benefit from services of international organizations, whether it's SMEs or government agencies, but it may give you an indication about what types of partnerships it's looking for in terms of international engagements. And I've linked to these at the end of the presentation. I think these are coming from that last document that I just mentioned from the Australian Space Agency. The particular areas it's trying to focus on is water management and water monitoring, and vegetation management and vegetation monitoring. So if your organization has services that are applicable to these fields, might be worth reaching out to the Australian Space Agency. The contact details I've listed in the presentation as well. And the government does recognise that it's a major customer of EO data, which I think, from your point of view, is a good thing, because if you can market yourself effectively to the government, then it's a pretty good customer to have. At the same time, there is industry growth in terms of consumption of EO data, and I'll explain where that comes from later on. But I might, there's no questions on that, and I appreciate that that was a rushed overview, but I hope it gave some insight just into some context. But I can now hand over to Peter, who can speak a bit more to our company, where we fit into this and what services we offer.
Thanks, Scott, and hello, everyone. Thanks very much for the opportunity to be with you today. Scott, I'm just going to request remote control so that I can potentially move the slides forward when I'm ready. Southern Launch has been developing launch services, so perhaps a little bit removed from your core business, but obviously without launch facilities and small launch vehicles taking payloads to space, there can be no Earth observation. So in Australia, there is a lot of activity in developing space capability, particularly a focus on sovereign capability. And the Australian government is putting a lot of support into companies like ours developing these capabilities, not just for government services, but also for commercial use as well, with a goal to driving additional revenues and full-time employment for people in the space industry. You might have seen on the backgrounds from Scott and myself, pictures of land masses behind. So we have 2 launch sites. One is at Kaniba, which I'll show you on a map shortly, and the other is at Whalers Way. And these are just in the process of being developed and operated so that we can provide to launch vehicles the opportunity to test their vehicles, but also the payloads, and then to launch them to space. That opportunity, there we go. So the first of our sites is Whalers Way, which is at the very bottom of Eyre Peninsula in South Australia, at a place called Whalers Way, which is about 35 minutes drive from the regional city of Port Lincoln. And it's an ideal site for providing sun-synchronous and polar orbits, which seems to be probably about 50% of the requirements of small launched and small lift vehicles. We have a small launch pad there at the moment, and you can see on the left there, the first launch that we did in September with a Taiwanese vehicle called Hapith-1. That was a small 2-stage vehicle which was doing a suborbital test, and to be followed by a 3-stage vehicle which will then be able to lift payloads up to about 350 kilograms to sun-synchronous orbit and about 390 kilograms to LEO in a polar orbit. The site has about 6 kilometers of south-facing coastline, and so it's an ideal location for launching because we're not encumbered by population areas in the trajectory path. The next stop is Antarctica, about 3,500 kilometers away, and there's very little air or maritime traffic, and so it's an ideal location for rapid access to space. Because of the 6 kilometers of coastline, we have the opportunity to build a number of different size and scale launch sites along that coastline. And our goal is to be able to launch rapidly. So within 48 hours notice, it should be feasible to bring a launch vehicle to site and for it to be ready for launch and for a launch window to open and be coordinated. We have great support from the South Australian government, including the Premier of our state, who's provided us with additional support so that we can move through the development application process fairly rapidly. On the right-hand side, you can see our goal for developing sites at that location. So going from a standard and fairly basic concrete launch pad to providing an assembly, integration and testing building, funding for fuel, and a full launch pad facility with flame trench and water deluge. Perhaps you can move that on for me, Scott. It's not changing. Thank you. As mentioned, it's an ideal location for sun-sync and polar. We can also do high inclinations down to about 60 degrees before the island of Kangaroo Island gets in the way of our flight path. We've got 1,200 hectares of land there, so it's plenty of room for us to develop multiple sites. And as I mentioned also, the town of Port Lincoln provides us with support, not only in terms of industrial support, but also accommodation and restaurants, etc., that are required when a team come out to do a launch campaign. Next slide, please, Scott. The other side is Kaniba, which is further to the northwest of Whalers Way, which is still in South Australia. It is I think the longest overland test range in the Southern Hemisphere. We have 145 kilometres of downrange area and about 10,000 square kilometres range area to launch into. And it's an ideal location for testing rockets and their payloads, suborbital flights, which can be recovered in the fairly sparse land that's to the north of the launch pad. We're just south of the Woomera prohibited area, which is a defence region. And if we are to coordinate with the defence capabilities, it's feasible for us to also fly into that area, which gives us up to about 450 kilometres of downrange. Next slide, thanks, Scott. This was the first ever launch facility to be licensed by the Australian Space Agency. And since that time, we've also had the Whalers Way launch facility licensed by the Australian Space Agency. So Southern Launch holds the only two licensed launch facilities in Australia at this point in time. And you can see some of the opportunities for trajectories. You can see in the bottom picture that it's a fairly barren and sparse land, which makes it ideal for recovering rockets and payloads once they've been launched. We see it as an ideal testing area for civilian and military technologies. And as I say, we can potentially fly into the Woomera prohibited area if we have agreement with the Department of Defence. Next slide, thanks, Scott. We did our first launch from that site back in September of 2020. And it was a very small rocket, but we actually launched two of them within a couple of hours of each other. And we were able to recover those vehicles once they were located well out into the bush. So those are our two launch facilities. Scott, next slide, please. We also provide professional services for the ability to design and do analysis. So we can do rocket vehicle design. We do flight safety analysis and trajectory optimization. We have our own in-house software for doing modeling and range safety so that we can work out exclusion zones for launches. We can do the maximum probable loss calculations that are required for insurance purposes and for providing the information required by the Australian Space Agency in order to provide a launch permit. So it's a fairly full suite of services that we provide, right through from doing the design through to actually operating the range and providing support for a launch vehicle and its payload. So that's us in a nutshell. I'll hand back to Scott, who will continue on with some more detail.
Thanks, Peter. I will try and please respect the time here, but I'll go through as concise as I can, just some considerations for when you're actually doing business in Australia. Things like what practical considerations you need to take into account when you're engaging a company or when you're trying to set up an organisation in Australia. Really, the main thing to keep in mind is what type of engagement you're having with Australia. Is Australia an Australian entity your customer, or is it a supplier or collaborator? And that will depend, that decision or that situation will then bring about what types of considerations you need to take into account going forward. But a big one, which is not unique to Australia, is export control laws, transferring data or information or products out of the country, which is a big consideration for any type of international space engagement, particularly in the private sector. If there's an international engagement about how the information coming into Australia is, of course, the responsibility of the international organisation to resolve, but then any data or products coming back out of Australia to that international entity, of course, have to take into account whether it has any dual use capability or if it is actually indeed a military item. So this is a very high level overview of how international organisations set up a presence in Australia. A very simple way is setting up what's called a branch office, which means essentially you have representation in Australia from your entity, but there's no legal distinction other than, of course, you have to comply with Australia's laws. You're not actually registered as an Australian company. If you become a subsidiary, that changes. Then you become under the scope of the Corporations Act, which I've linked to here, which you probably don't need to read, but it's good to know what it is, and you can read some commentary on the Corporations Act and how it works on the on ASIC's website, the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, who administer the Corporations Act. And there's non-legal and very quite straightforward interpretations of the Corporations Act and about how to set up a presence in Australia. Of course, then another common way is acquiring an existing business in Australia, depending on what the advantages of that are. But yeah, I suggest that you keep the Australian Securities and Investment Commission website handy if you ever are doing business with an Australian company, particularly if you want to set up presence in Australia, because that'll provides quite clear information about what you need to consider and how not to break the law, actually. If you're not setting up a presence in Australia and you're just merely forming an engagement with an Australian entity, the Corporations Act is less relevant because you don't actually have any physical presence in Australia. But these are some considerations which aren't unique to doing business in Australia. So you probably won't be unfamiliar to them, but it's just good to reiterate them, I think. Contract law is, of course, important, particularly when you're working out whether it's Australia's law or the law of your home nation, which is going to be governing that contract. And that particularly becomes important if there's ever a dispute. Another big one is that if your company or if a company that you're collaborating with concerns a space object or providing services from space, then insurance and liability issues is quite an important topic, particularly for Australia as well. So if you're providing the spacecraft, something to do with the spacecraft that collects the remote sensing data, then that's something that'll need to be considered in the commercial engagements, as opposed to just providing the data that comes from the spacecraft. It's important to look at what international agreements there are that concern trade arrangements with Australia. There is no free trade agreement yet with the European Union, but I understand that that's ongoing. And then so in the coming 12 to 24 months, that may be finalized, or there may be more indications about what kind of opportunities that'll provide for. And of course, just working out, Australia generally does a pretty good job complying with the international engagements that it signs up to, the international treaty regimes that it signs up to, which is a good thing for business security for international companies who are doing business in Australia, is that they can have pretty strong, high confidence that Australia is not going to breach any of these international frameworks that govern corruption or misuse of funds and things like that. So that's also important to consider and may reaffirm any considerations you had for doing business in Australia. So I mentioned that this was a particularly important area with Australia, and I think it applies to any country you're doing business with. But it would be good to spend 2 or 3 minutes on this slide just to give you an overview, because it's quite easy, if you're not paying attention, to get caught up in Australia's export control regime. Depending, again, I'm not sure what services or products your companies provide, but remote sensing data may fall into this regime. So it's good to understand how it works. The main thing is that this hyperlink that I've put down the bottom, that's a good thing you should keep in your library as well, because again, that quite clearly outlines how the regime works. So you don't have to troll through the legislation and legal documents. You can actually just go to the government's website, and it has a pretty concise, pretty clear English language explanation. But in a nutshell, how it works is the government commissions an agency called Defence Export Controls, which reports to the Minister of Defence in the Australian National Government. And Defence Export Controls, it governs the export, the supply, and the publication of military items or items that have a dual use capability. So they need not be produced for defence purposes, but if they could be used for a defence purpose, then it falls under this framework. So that's, you can see how easy that Earth observation services and data may fall into a dual use category. The first place to go to work out whether your products or services would fall into this controlled list, controlled environment, is to look at the Defence and Strategic Goods list. However, that's not the end of the story, because there are some things that fall outside of this list which are still included in the framework, and they're what we call military end use. So they're not quite dual use goods and not quite military goods, but they're items or services, let's say, that could contribute to a dual use good or to a military item. So it can be quite vague without knowing what exactly the scope covers. And usually legal advice or getting advice from a customs broker can answer these questions for you rather than having to try and work through them yourselves. But I think that at the end of the day, just keep this hyperlink handy. And the company that you're engaged with in Australia as well, it's really their responsibility to know this. Privacy laws, of course, are also important. How you manage your data if you're doing business with an Australian entity, or if you set up a presence in Australia, then you'll need to make sure that you comply with Australia's privacy laws, which don't apply to all businesses, actually, only if you have an annual turnover of more than 3 million Australian dollars, which I guess is around between 1.5 and 2 million euro. Then you must comply with the Australian privacy laws, which aren't really that burdensome. I don't think they're as burdensome as the GDPR, but they do need to be complied with, otherwise that's an offence. And importantly, as with all organisations in any country, the GDPR may apply to an Australian entity, and indeed it would if it concerns information from individuals who are in Europe. But I imagine the GDPR is something that you're already familiar with anyway. It's just another layer if you have to consider the Australian privacy laws also. And this is just, I think, a useful overview of how the government framework in Australia is structured. And this is relevant because depending on, particularly as well, it's relevant if you're establishing a business presence in Australia, then you'll need to consider this framework, because depending on what type of business service or product you're offering, it depends on which area of government you need to appeal to in order to have a regulatory approval. But in terms of remote sensing business, it'd be pretty safe to say that everything would be under the federal jurisdiction, particularly because that's how international company affairs are managed and domestic company affairs. I think these organisations are a good start if you are interested to look further into doing business with Australia, because the information that Peter and I can give you is limited in a sense, because we're not actively or directly engaged in the EO market, although we provide services to that market. It's not our primary business is focusing on launch services to that market, not the actual demand in the market itself. But the Department of Industries, Science, Energy and Resources is the department that is responsible for the Australian Space Agency, and also for integrating the Australian Space Agency's priorities among other areas of government frameworks. And part of its mission, or part of its objectives, is to encourage Australian entities to engage where appropriate with international organisations, and particularly in terms of its space portfolio, is to maintain Australia's good relationships with the international providers of EO data and services. So whether or not you're already providing data to an Australian organisation, offering an enhanced capability that can enhance Australia's secure access to that data or service provision, may be something that appeals to the government. SmartSat Cooperative Research Centre, I think, also is worth reaching out to. How this works, cooperative research centres, there are for all types of research and industry areas. This one happens to be on using next generation technologies and services in terms of satellite use and application. And one of the three pillars of this particular cooperative research centre is focusing on next generation Earth observation data services. And this works on a matched funding model. So if you have a project, you think, it could be a research project and you think it has some benefit to Australia and you need some funding for it, theoretically, you could apply to come under this framework, and whatever money you have available for this project, it would be matched by this organisation, essentially matched by the government of Australia to look into that project. But also there are many organisations that are members to this Cooperative Research Centre that may be useful for you to engage with, because they may be Earth observation service providers or data users that you may be able to collaborate with or market to. This isn't, I don't think there would be many engagement opportunities, but this would be a good place. SEBA and GITA, it's the Spatial Industry Business Association and the Geospatial Industry Technology Association, I think. It's the advocacy body for this industry in Australia. So although its interests are for Australian entities, predominantly in terms of the regulatory frameworks and funding and red tape and things like this, it might be good to reach out to them to just work out what opportunities there might be for international engagements, or if there is any room for the services that you provide to enhance or strengthen the capability of the members of this organisation. So I don't think you could become a member, but you may be able to have a collaboration with the members of this organisation, which is the reason I included it here. And also, when the government and the reports commissioned by the government, a few of them emphasise that there is a risk of Australia having a denial of service. So this comes back to what I mentioned before of the Australian government having a priority to maintain the secure access to Earth observation data and services from an international point of view. And so the concern is that the more we become dependent on this, the higher the risk is that if we don't have access to that anymore, then a lot of the services that we use for the application of EO data are not going to be effective, and that would be a problem for Australia because of Australia's dependence on that field. And so I mentioned the Australian Space Agency before. If you email them, the inquiries email, Carla Rodriguez is the manager of the International Engagement Division of the Australian Space Agency. So they don't only look at how Australia can deliver services to the international market, but he looks at as well, his team looks at how the international market can benefit Australia's capabilities as well, which includes selling products or services to Australia. The Austrade, the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, really focuses more on the first aspect of that, about the exportation of Australian goods or services. But it would be worth touching base with them anyway to work out whether your services or data could fit into the market here. or if there's any collaboration opportunities or funding opportunities that you can get involved in. And this is a coincidentally well-timed event that's happening in a couple of days. This is being run by the SmartSat CRC that I mentioned earlier, and in collaboration with the Italian organization, focusing on what opportunities there are for startups, which I suppose can apply to SMEs as well in Australia, particularly in the field of Earth observation. So you might want, and I think, yeah, so it's around this time as well. So it's pretty good for Central European time. It's 8 o'clock in the morning on Monday. So that might be worth registering. And it's a free event as well. So I think these are the main things. Again, I'm not sure of your business priorities or even what your business areas are, but from me, looking at it, if I were doing business, coming from abroad, doing business in Australia, in Earth observation, these are the things I would try and keep in mind, is that we have a big dependence on EO data and a big dependence from international, the data coming from international operators and service providers. And as well as doing business in Australia, of course, there are practical considerations mainly around export control laws, but also general customs and commercial matters. So which areas of these are relevant to consider if you wanted to do business with Australia or in Australia or from Australia? And also try reaching out to the Australian Space Agency, Austrade, the Industry Association, CEBA that I mentioned, and the SmartSat CSC, or even just have a look at their websites and the reports they have produced in terms of remote sensing information, and see if there's any opportunity there for your organizations. And these, I mean, the law is just there for your reference, but the reports that are listed here in the websites here, I think are pretty useful for a starting point in terms of doing your own research or considering what's important if you are wanting to engage or do business from Australia. But I hope that has been somewhat helpful in terms of a broad overview of context. And Peter and I are happy to answer any questions about Southern Launch in particular, or about anything in the presentation that might not have been clear. Otherwise, I can hand back to Sandra.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Peter, for your very thoughtful presentation. So we have time for questions. Again, don't forget to use either open your camera or or use the chat box. So I have one question from Matthias. I'm going to read it also for recording purposes. Do you know of any initiative or a program or an organization who would be interested in using, I'm guessing?
Fusing.
Oh, there you go, Matthias. Well, why don't you raise your question?
Sure. So what we seem to need for fire spread prediction model is to estimate the type of vegetation and how dry it is. And there is a lot of nice satellite data out there from near infrared, imagery and SAR data and so on. But the resolution is very low and there is a certain time delay. And I wonder if there is anyone or anybody or any organization who is already thinking in this direction, that maybe we can combine somehow the drone aerial data that we can get in real time with the satellite data, and then kind of like enhance the precision of it.
Yeah, I think the first, I don't know is the answer to my question, but I would suggest that you look into the CSIRO's website, Centre for Science and Industry Research Organization, Central rather, because they have that, they have a program which focuses on this type of integration, particularly with what other non-space services might be able to enhance. And that's called Digital Earth Australia. So they may have a demand for incorporating that type of data.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you both. Is there any other question or follow-up on Matthias' question? Or if not, for now, I would like to ask our SMEs actually a question that it is more on the actors that Scott and Peter mentioned that were in the engagement considerations slide, or I think there was also another slide where Scott and Peter mentioned some actors. So for us, as you know, we're trying as well to match Australian actors and match them with our SMEs. So for me, it would be more to know if these names are of interest to you, so we can again, so we can follow up this and start as well this contact. So if you type either, if there was one that was of your interest, please feel free to do so. So for us, it will be useful as a useful guidance when we start to do either a B2B or any other type of match. So I like the SMEs to manifest themselves in the chat if there is any actor, any name that you're interested in.
And also, I should also mention, Sandra, that generally the culture in Australia is quite open to receiving cold calls about what Australian companies, or even if it's a research organisation or a collaborative initiative, it's quite easy to, and generally, I mean, to just contact them and ask a question. Most of the time, people are quite proud to talk about what they're doing and to try and work out if there's any collaborative opportunities. So reaching out to a government agency or to a non-government organisation is usually quite easy to establish a connection, even if there's really little context for doing so.
So,
yeah, if I may, this is Olivier from Unseen Labs. I'm sorry for the camera. I have to choose for the bandwidth between the camera and the microphone, so I will choose the microphone. But thanks for the presentation, and to answer your question, I mean, yeah, Unseen Labs, what we are doing in few words, we're on Earth observation on maritime surveillance based on our constellation of Cube satellites. So we have a constellation of satellite and monitoring activities at seas. So we provide data to our customers. So definitely, yeah, you mentioned some name, Scott and Peter, that they are in our list, let's say, for example, Csiro or Geoscience in Australia, that definitely the good, for us, maybe good opportunity to discuss with. So yeah, so this definitely it's interesting. And I have a question, or if you just gotten last of your slide you present as well, that on Monday they have an event for the startup, or on Monday, and can you maybe have more information how we can register or something?
Yeah, sorry, I'll put this in the chat. What I'll do is I'll send Sandra this slide momentarily after the presentation, after we leave. But I've also just put in the chat the registration page.
Got it. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivier.
No, you're welcome. Yeah.
Is there any other questions? For example, someone of you maybe want to set up an office in Australia that you want to ask, and there's any consideration that you want to ask, or for you it's better to look for a partner over there rather than going solo, or any other comment you want to share? No.
It's 30 degrees Celsius today. It's a very good place to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to take advantage of this time. Yes.
No, this is Olivier again. Yeah. I mean, definitely also Australia is a good place. We know that we had the chance. 2 years ago, before everything happened. Now we had the chance to visit as well. Yeah, Australia and South Australia, Adelaide and Sydney. But yeah, definitely it's a good place for us. So probably we have in mind the next coming months, or maybe years, to maybe open an office over there, or a subsidiary. But now we are working with some partners and local partners, to try to develop on our business in Australia. Yeah. But definitely this is a place where we would like to go again, and hopefully this year. But let's see in the coming weeks and months. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. It's hard to get there physically at the moment, but it's probably easier to set up a company there than it is to travel there at the moment.
Okay. Yeah. We have seen for a tennisman, it's not so easy to be in Australia.
Yeah, that's right.
I will raise a question in the meantime that maybe some of you would also have a better one. During our contact with our SMEs, there were some that were actually saying that some of Australian customers have reached them to provide Earth observation applications, because in Australia there is not enough satellite imagery. So that's why they came to our SMEs. The question was more for our SMEs, because they thought that they would go to Australian providers to look for imagery, and because they thought Australian would have more imagery rather than them looking within their European providers. In your opinion, to Peter and Scott, I'm guessing that, as you mentioned, Australia is a bit dependent on those resources. As an advice for this SME, do you think that it is more likely that European providers would have imagery rather than the logic saying that, let me look for someone in Australia to provide imagery and so I can do my my application?
Well, I think it's a good point. I think it's not surprising that, the Australians were looking for the imagery rather than being able to provide it. But because of this push now, both from the industry associations and the government's recognition of this, I think that there may be more opportunities for Australia to have its own missions that, well, not just mission, but also its acquisition of imagery. So I'm just, that might be a way for members of ERSC to engage there, as if they have a demand for this imagery and it's able to be clearly articulated. That might give the Australian industry the ammunition it needs to get research grants or funding subsidies from government or something like this, to actually be able to develop this capability to provide that type of imagery, because that is something that the industry is trying to develop, because that's I think that's really the only area that it lacks in the supply chain process, is actually the acquisition or the production of the imagery, let's say. So, but I'm just trying to think of where, like, if you contacted Frontier SI, which is a big company in Australia, I don't know if I've referenced it in the report, but there was the AusCalVal report that is in there. They, the producers of that report, probably would be a good place to try and work out where Australia is at in terms of being able to provide that type of imagery. I don't think it would be anytime soon, but it's something that we'll be developing, I think, in the coming years.
Thank you, Scott. Yes, and well, for Frontiers, actually Brendan is is with us, who's part of Frontiers and is also part of ERSC, in charge of the front office Australia for the Connect-EU project.
Good thing.
So just to let you know. So if we don't have any more questions, I would like to close this webinar. Thank you all for coming. Thank you also, Scott and Peter, for your very insightful presentation. We can share your contact details, of course, as well, if our members are interested. And with this, you know, the presentation will be also available to you. And that will be all on my side. Thank you again, and let's stay tuned for another series of webinars for February. So with that, I thank you all, and I wish you all a very nice day or evening in Australia.
Thank you very much.
Nice to speak with you. Happy for the opportunity. Thanks, Sandra.
Thank you.
Bye now.